The night sky over the Bismarck Sea flickered with distant thunder, but the ocean below was calm, too calm for a war zone. It was March 1943, just after dawn, when a lone B-25 Mitchell skimmed barely 30 feet above the water, its engines pushing against the humid Pacific air. Salt spray streaked the glass. The crew inside felt the aircraft tremble, but the man in the left seat held it steady, eyes fixed on the horizon. Captain John "Jock" Henebry wasn't flying a standard bomber. His B-25 had been stripped, reshaped, and rebuilt into something most engineers said could never work, a low-flying gunship with 8.50 caliber machine guns firing forward in a single devastating wave. An aircraft meant not for altitude, but for brutality. Ahead of him, through the morning haze, shapes began to materialize. Dozens of Japanese transport ships, destroyers, and escorts, an entire convoy stretching across the sea. Henebry's crew knew what they were about to attempt. They also knew no handbook had ever been written for it. And yet, the impossible aircraft was descending toward its first kill. The moment demands context, how such a machine came to exist at all. To understand how a B-25 Mitchell bomber transformed into a low-flying ship killer, the story must begin months before the Bismarck Sea turned into a graveyard for the Imperial Japanese Army. In late 1942, the Pacific theater was drowning in uncertainty. The United States had won at Midway, but the Japanese Empire still controlled a vast defensive perimeter stretching from Burma to the Solomon Islands. Every island, every jungle airstrip, every convoy mattered. New Guinea was one of those places. A rugged, unforgiving landmass split by towering mountains, suffocating humidity, and disease-ridden swamps, it became a central axis of the Allied campaign to push north toward the Philippines. Whoever controlled its airspace controlled the sea lanes that fed Japanese garrisons from Rabaul, their largest stronghold in the region. But controlling that airspace was no simple task. American medium bombers, like the B-25, had been designed for high-altitude bombing. In theory, they could destroy shipping from 5 or 10,000 feet. In practice, they couldn't. Bombs dropped from altitude rarely hit moving ships. The Japanese convoys learned to zigzag, accelerate, scatter, and cover themselves in smoke. The results were abysmal: thousands of pounds of ordnance wasted, fuel burned for little return, and ships that slipped away untouched. The Allied command knew that something had to change. General George C. Kenney, commander of the 5th Air Force, studied the problem with a blunt realism that matched the moment. New Guinea wasn't a comfortable place to fight. It was a place where innovation replaced manuals, and improvisation replaced doctrine. When pilots complained that standard bombing runs were useless, Kenney listened. He needed a weapon that didn't exist. It was around this time that the idea of a commerce destroyer, a bomber that could attack ships from extremely low altitude, began to take shape. Something that could rush in just above the water, unleash a devastating burst of gunfire, and then drop a bomb at point-blank range. But the engineering teams weren't convinced. The B-25, as originally designed, carried a bombardier in the nose. Its front was built for glass, not steel. Mounting multiple heavy machine guns forward meant ripping out the bombardier's station and replacing it with armor plating, custom mounts, extra ammunition boxes, and reinforced wiring. The center of gravity would shift. The recoil forces were untested. The airflow would change. Stability at low altitude was questionable. Every test report seemed to point toward one conclusion: this would not work. But Kenney didn't accept that answer. He redirected his most skilled mechanics, metal workers, and field engineers to modify the aircraft anyway. They tore open the nose, reinforced the fuselage, and aligned the guns with near-mathematical precision. They added additional side-mounted guns to allow strafing during approach. What emerged was something radical: a medium bomber transformed into a fast, brutal gunship. By the end of 1942, the 5th Air Force had built the first operational models. Pilots who saw them up close realized instantly what they had: a flying sledgehammer. When the guns fired together, the aircraft shook violently, but the stream of .50 caliber fire could shred wooden vessels, disable anti-aircraft crews, and carve holes in steel hull plating. Yet even this was not enough. The crews still needed a way to ensure bombs would land precisely on a speeding ship. Standard releases were useless. Dive bombing was too dangerous. The answer came from the Royal Air Force: skip bombing. It was a simple idea, borrowed from the mechanics of skipping stones across a pond. Bombs released at low altitude and high speed would bounce across the water, slam into a ship, and detonate on contact. The combination of forward-firing guns and skip bombing was unlike anything Japan had faced. By early 1943, Kenny finally had the tool he needed. But no one knew how it would perform in real combat. The true test arrived when Allied scouts discovered a major Japanese convoy sailing from Rabaul to reinforce La, one of the most critical Japanese positions in New Guinea. Dozens of ships. Thousands of troops. Escort vessels armed to the teeth. And directly in their path were the new B-25 gunships, waiting for their first chance to prove whether the impossible aircraft could actually reshape the Pacific War. The scale of that convoy sets the stage for what came next. The Japanese convoy that sailed from Rabaul in late February 1943 was not just another supply run. It represented one of the Imperial Army's most ambitious attempts to reinforce its failing foothold in New Guinea. The situation around La had deteriorated sharply, and the Japanese command believed that fresh troops, artillery, ammunition, and engineering units might stabilize the front. To accomplish this, they assembled Operation 81, a formation of 8 transports and 8 destroyers. The transports carried almost 7,000 troops. The destroyers, some of Japan's most capable, formed a protective ring designed to repel Allied air attacks. Their commanders trusted that speed, maneuverability, and dense anti-aircraft fire would keep the convoy safe. But the Japanese were unaware of what awaited them. Since January, Allied reconnaissance flights had maintained a constant watch over the Bismarck Sea, the stretch of water between New Britain and New Guinea. Coast watchers, ground observers, and signal intercept teams pieced together the scattered reports. By the end of February, Allied intelligence was certain: a major convoy was preparing to sail. General Kenny understood that this was the moment he had been preparing for. If these reinforcements reached La, Australian and American troops on the ground would face a brutal surge of manpower. If the convoy could be destroyed at sea, the Japanese campaign in eastern New Guinea would collapse. What made this moment especially precarious was weather. The Bismarck Sea was notorious for its sudden storms. Entire formations could vanish into cloud cover, and ships could hide beneath rain squalls. When the convoy finally departed on February 28, heavy weather shielded it. Allied pilots flew long, punishing reconnaissance missions but often returned without sighting anything besides endless gray. Still, the Allies persisted. On March 1, the sky finally cleared enough for a Royal Australian Air Force patrol bomber to spot the convoy. The sighting report was precise: 8 transports, 8 destroyers, heading southwest at roughly 8 knots. The moment the message reached headquarters, the entire 5th Air Force sprang into action. The urgency was palpable. Flight crews ran to their aircraft. Armorers loaded ammunition belts. Ground teams fueled the new, heavily modified B-25s. Many of these planes had only been completed days earlier. Their fresh coats of paint still smelled of solvents. Ammunition boxes were packed into every available space: floor compartments, under seats, along the walls. The men who climbed into those planes understood the risks. Low-level attack runs invited constant fire. Ships bristled with machine guns and rapid-fire cannons. The accuracy of Japanese gunners at sea was well respected. Many crews had witnessed aircraft being sliced apart during prior missions. But the new tactics demanded extreme proximity, flying so low that pilots were sometimes only a few meters above the waves. To prepare for this, Allied training had grown increasingly intense. Pilots practiced at treetop level until the sound of branches whipping under their wings became familiar. Bombardiers learned to estimate release points visually instead of relying on instruments. Gunners rehearsed firing windows again and again. The B-25s, now transformed into aggressive gunships, needed crews comfortable with precision and controlled aggression. By the morning of March 2, the conditions aligned. Clear skies to the north. Calm waters. Winds low enough for stable low-altitude approaches. The Japanese convoy steamed forward, unaware that layers of Allied aircraft, medium bombers, heavy bombers, Beaufighters, and the newly armed B-25s, were assembling overhead. But there was another layer of preparation that would define the coming battle. The 5th Air Force Command planned to coordinate multiple attack waves. Heavy bombers would strike from altitude to force the convoy into defensive maneuvers. Beaufighters would approach at mast height to suppress anti-aircraft gunners. Then, at the most critical moment, the B-25 gunships would sweep in at high speed, unleashing torrents of .50 caliber fire and dropping skip bombs at the closest possible range. This combination was unprecedented. The Japanese expected one type of attack, not three. They had prepared for high-altitude bombing, not a coordinated, multi-layered assault that weaponized chaos. Kenny and his team believed that synchronized disruption, breaking the convoy's rhythm and overwhelming its defenses, was the key to victory. With the plan in motion, the stage was set for the kind of battle the Pacific had not yet seen. What began as a desperate attempt by Japan to reinforce a distant garrison was about to collide with one of the most innovative tactical evolutions of the air war. The next hours would determine whether the impossible B-25 gunship could justify the faith placed in it. When dawn rose on March 3, 1943, the Japanese convoy had already endured hours of harassment from high-flying B-17s. The attacks had not sunk any ships, but they achieved exactly what Kenny's staff intended: the convoy's formation had fractured. Transports drifted out of alignment. Destroyers weaved unpredictably, trying to screen their charges. And every time a bomber appeared in the distance, the ships erupted in anti-aircraft fire, wasting ammunition and stressing their crews. Fatigue began to show. But the real attack had not yet begun. On the Allied side, the airfields of New Guinea erupted with movement. The new B-25 gunships were fueled, armed, and arranged into squadrons. Pilots received last-minute briefings outlining their attack runs. There would be no second chances. Every pilot had to fly low, so low the spray from the sea might hit the underside of the aircraft. Every bomb had to be released at exactly the right moment. Every gunner had to be ready for dense, overlapping fields of fire coming from below. Leadership across the 5th Air Force understood this was a make-or-break trial of their new doctrine. If the low-level strike failed, they risked losing dozens of aircraft. If it succeeded, it would rewrite the tactical formula for anti-shipping warfare. This understanding had shaped their preparations long before the battle. The birth of a new strike force months earlier, engineers at places like Townsville and Port Moresby had pushed themselves to the edge of exhaustion, creating the new B-25 modifications. Many of the mechanics were young men who had never expected to redesign aircraft in the field. They bent metal by hand, welded custom frames, reinforced bulkheads, and fabricated mounts that were never part of the original aircraft blueprint. Some modifications were crude but effective: extra plates welded into the nose, ammunition chutes cut through thin aluminum skins, side windows replaced by gun ports. Others required mathematical precision, particularly the alignment of the 8 forward-facing .50 caliber guns. A small error in angle or vibration damping could cause rounds to scatter widely instead of forming a concentrated stream. The crews who tested the aircraft discovered something unexpected: at low altitude, the additional weight forward actually helped stability during strafing runs. The nose-heavy configuration reduced lift fluctuations and made the aircraft feel more planted, almost like a fast-moving attack boat. But stability did not reduce danger. Pilots trained repeatedly against mock ship targets. They learned to approach at about 200 to 250 miles per hour, drop to mast height, fire a long burst to suppress enemy gunners, then release their bomb at a range so close it left almost no room for error. After release, they had to climb sharply, clearing the ship's superstructure by a margin of mere seconds. This training laid the foundation for what would occur at the Bismarck Sea. Japanese expectations and misjudgments. While the Allies prepared meticulously, the Japanese convoy commanders remained confident that their destroyers could repel low-level attacks. Their doctrine emphasized rapid defensive maneuvers, smoke deployment, tight turns, and concentrated anti-aircraft bursts. But Japanese naval planners did not anticipate a coordinated aerial assault combining strafing, skip bombing, and mast-height approaches. More critically, they underestimated the precision of Allied intelligence. Signals intercept teams tracked radio transmissions. Coast watchers stationed on remote islands provided sightings from hidden vantage points. American and Australian reconnaissance aircraft maintained a rotating watch pattern. By March 2, the Allies not only knew the convoy's position, they could predict its path. The Japanese believed weather would shield them. But on March 3, the storm system that had cloaked the convoy dissipated. Clear skies opened above the Bismarck Sea, exposing the formation like a fleet on a vast, blue stage. The timing was perfect for the 5th Air Force. The moment before collision, shortly before 10 a.m., the first Allied strike groups took off. Heavy bombers climbed to altitude. Bullfighters hugged the coastline. The B-25 gunships waited in clusters, their engines vibrating across the airfields in rhythmic pulses. Pilots exchanged brief, quiet glances, no bravado, no chatter. Everyone understood that the coming minutes would define not only the battle but the future of low-level air tactics in the Pacific. On the Japanese ships, lookouts scanned the sky with growing anxiety. The earlier B-17 attacks had convinced some officers that the worst was over. Others, especially on the escort destroyers, sensed the opposite, that the absence of attackers was merely a pause before a far more dangerous wave. At 10:15, the distant roar of engines became audible. Dozens of specks appeared low on the horizon, flying in tight formation. For the Japanese convoy, this was the final moment of relative order. For the Allies, it marked the threshold of the battle that would prove whether the impossible B-25 gunship had been worth the struggle, the innovation, and the gamble that brought it into existence. The collision was seconds away. The Japanese convoy held its course as the distant specks grew larger, their engines now a steady, rising growl across the open sea. On the bridges of the transports and destroyers, officers shouted orders. Gunners sprinted to their weapons. Ammunition runners hauled fresh boxes of 25mm and 13mm rounds up ladders. Whistles and alarms echoed across the decks. Moments later, the sky above the convoy erupted. But the aircraft diving toward them were not the B-25s. They were the heavy bombers, the B-17 flying fortresses of the 43rd Bomb Group, beginning the first stage of the orchestrated assault. Flying from high altitude, they released strings of bombs that forced the convoy into frantic evasive maneuvers. Transports swung violently. Destroyers split away to the flanks. Smoke screens blossomed across the water. The Japanese gunners opened fire, filling the sky with bursts of black flak, but the B-17 stayed out of reach. Their attack was never meant to sink ships. Its purpose was psychological and structural: disrupt formation, scatter defenses, and make the convoy vulnerable for the decisive strikes that followed. Below, the chaos spread exactly as Allied planners had hoped. Lines broke. Orders clashed. Ship captains cursed the confusion. Amid the disorder, the convoy's tightly woven defensive shield began to unravel. That was the moment the second wave arrived. The Beaufighters strike. The Royal Australian Air Force's Bristol Beaufighters swept in from the southwest, flying at mast height. Their approach was so low that some Japanese lookouts failed to spot them until they were almost on top of the convoy. Beaufighters were not carrying bombs. They were carrying fire. Their role was suppression: eliminate anti-aircraft positions, silence bridge crews, and paralyze the ships long enough for the B-25s to attack unopposed. On their first passes, they unleashed streams of 20mm cannon fire and machine gun bursts that ripped into the superstructures of the transports and escorts. Japanese gunners, trained to fire upward, were caught off guard by attackers slicing horizontally across the waves. Some mount crews fought back bravely, but many batteries were wiped out before they could bring their guns to bear. Dozens of sailors fell. Command posts were hit. Radio rooms went silent. The convoy staggered, but the battle's decisive blow still had not been delivered. The first B-25 squadron arrives at 10:25 a.m., the B-25 gunships finally entered the fight. They came in fast, flying in elements of 3 and 4, lining up with individual transports like predators closing on prey. The modified noses of the aircraft glinted in the sunlight, dark, steel-armored, and bristling with .50 caliber barrels. Inside each cockpit, pilots pushed their throttles forward, committing to a level of proximity to enemy fire that felt nearly suicidal. The Japanese ships were now fully alert. Their guns spat fire in thick curtains. Splashes erupted around the B-25s. Tracers climbed upward in glowing arcs. But the B-25 pilots held steady. The forward guns opened first. 8.50 calibers firing simultaneously produced a sound like tearing metal combined with thunder. Their bullets traced bright, slashing lines across the decks of the transports, ripping through gunners, shredding equipment, and driving crews to the floor. Then came the moment every pilot trained for. At a range of only 300 to 400 yards, they released their skip bombs. The bombs, delayed fuse 500-pounders, hit the surface, bounced once, and slammed into the hulls of the transports with devastating force. The technique was brutally effective. Ship after ship suffered direct hits at point-blank distance. Aboard the Kembu Maru, a forward magazine detonated after a bomb struck just below deck level. Fire blossomed from the ship's center. The vessel listed sharply to port. Within minutes, crewmen were abandoning ship. On another transport, the Tio Maru, a skip bomb penetrated the starboard side and exploded deep inside the hold where troops were assembled for disembarkation. The blast ripped through bulkheads, sending smoke and debris into the air. The Japanese destroyers desperately tried to respond. They accelerated into the attack, firing intercepting bursts and attempting to ram incoming aircraft, but the bullfighters continued strafing, preventing a coordinated defense. For the B-25 squadrons, the sea had transformed into a deadly maze, ships maneuvering erratically, explosions lighting the water, tracer fire streaking along every approach vector. Yet the gunships pressed their advantage. On several runs, B-25 pilots came so low that their propellers threw spray back onto their fuselages. Some crews recalled flying lower than the tops of the destroyed ships they passed. The battle was turning. The Japanese convoy was unraveling. But the most destructive sequence was still ahead. Because the next wave of B-25s was led by the commander whose aircraft would become the symbol of the impossible gunship, an aircraft that would deliver one of the most devastating low-level attacks in the entire Pacific campaign. And his squadron was lining up for the final approach. The first wave of B-25 gunships had ripped through the convoy's perimeter, leaving smoking decks and panicked crews scrambling for cover. But the battle was far from over. Captain John Henebry's squadron, the centerpiece of the impossible modification project, was now approaching the southern flank. Their aircraft had been rebuilt to carry 8 forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns, additional side armaments, and reinforced armor, all while remaining fast enough to survive at perilously low altitudes. Every pilot knew that failure meant death. Every gunner knew that missing their mark meant the bombs of their comrades would be wasted. At 10:45 a.m., Henebry's B-25 peeled off from the formation, descending to just 30 feet above the rolling waves. The ocean spray hit the windscreen, the engines vibrating in a low, angry hum. Ahead, a Japanese transport ship, the Kembu Maru, struggled to maintain course amid smoke and explosions from earlier attacks. Its anti-aircraft crews attempted to line up shots, but the low trajectory of the B-25s made the task nearly impossible. Henebry's pilot eyes narrowed. He synchronized his squadron into a staggered approach, each plane spaced for maximum coverage. The forward guns erupted first, tearing into deck-mounted weapons and small boats used for troop deployment. The roar of 8.50 calibers shook the fuselage, the recoil forcing pilots to counter with precise control. Within seconds, the concentrated fire had neutralized almost all defensive positions on the transport. The next step was the skip bomb. Henebry gripped the release lever. At 200 miles per hour and mere meters above the waves, the bomb skipped once, then twice, before striking the hull amidships. The explosion rocked the vessel, tearing through deck and hold alike. Sailors were thrown into the water, flames began climbing the superstructure. The ship, meant to deliver thousands of troops, now burned uncontrollably. Simultaneously, other B-25s from Henebry's squadron executed parallel runs against adjacent transports. Each strike was calculated to overlap with the next, preventing Japanese destroyers from regrouping. Smoke, fire, and debris created visual confusion, forcing the convoy to scatter further. Tracer rounds from the escort stitched the sky with deadly patterns, but the B-25s, flying in tight but precise formation, evaded most of the fire. When minor hits occurred, damage control protocols designed during testing proved effective. Armor and reinforced bulkheads absorbed impacts that would have otherwise crippled the aircraft. By 11:15 a.m., the squadron had achieved a level of chaos that was unprecedented. Japanese commanders shouted into radios, trying to coordinate evasive maneuvers, but the convoy had fractured completely. Some transports were immobilized, others were attempting to flee individually. Destroyers attempted counterattacks, lining up rapid-fire bursts to intercept the low-flying B-25s. Yet the squadron's staggered timing and overlapping strafing runs ensured that each plane approached with minimal interference. The second wave, led by Henebry himself, targeted the remaining intact transports. He coordinated the approach through hand signals and pre-arranged timing. Radios were limited to avoid enemy interception. At 25 feet above the water, his plane's guns opened fire, shredding deck personnel and light artillery. Each skip bomb was released with surgical precision, bouncing off the surface and detonating near the hull, sending plumes of fire and water skyward. The psychological impact on Japanese crews was immediate. The once disciplined formation descended into panic. Ships began colliding as crews tried to maneuver through smoke and chaos. Lifeboats were launched prematurely, officers were shot down in command posts, and communication lines collapsed. Henebry's squadron, trained for such chaos, maintained strict formation, systematically targeting each remaining ship until 12 transports were either sunk or irreparably damaged. By 11:50 a.m., the B-25 gunships had completed their low-altitude assault. The ocean surface was littered with debris and burning wreckage. Flaming oil slicks traced the path of the convoy. Japanese destroyers, attempting to rescue survivors, were hesitant, leaving some crews stranded in the water for hours. Henebry's aircraft returned to base with minor damage, each plane showing signs of battle stress, pockmarked armor, spent ammunition boxes, and frayed wiring from gun vibrations, yet all crews survived. Engineers who had doubted the structural integrity of the gunship witnessed the results with a mixture of disbelief and reluctant admiration. 12 Japanese ships destroyed in 72 hours, a feat considered impossible just weeks earlier. The significance was clear. Allied intelligence immediately reported the effectiveness of the new B-25 gunship. Lessons learned from Henebry's daring low-level assaults reshaped Pacific air tactics. Skip bombing combined with forward-firing armament became a standard in anti-shipping operations. The impossible aircraft had rewritten the rules of engagement, proving that innovation under pressure could overcome both technical skepticism and battlefield reality. The battle's conclusion marked the beginning of a new era in aerial warfare, one where tactical ingenuity, structural modification, and human courage converged to turn impossible odds into historic victories. And from the smoking remains of the convoy, the Allies knew that Japanese reinforcement efforts in New Guinea had been permanently crippled, setting the stage for the eventual liberation of the region. The Bismarck Sea, once calm and serene beneath the morning sun, had become a tableau of destruction. Smoke curled into the sky from 12 burning transports. Flaming oil slicks stretched for miles across the water. Wounded sailors clung to debris, shouting for help amidst the chaos. Yet amid the devastation, the B-25 gunships remained operational, their crews executing precise formations to maintain pressure on any remaining vessels. Henebry's squadron had returned once, but intelligence indicated pockets of resistance, a few destroyers attempting to regroup, some transports still partially seaworthy. There would be no reprieve. The final assault required meticulous planning and flawless execution, a test of the gunship's endurance and the crew's nerves. At 12:30 p.m., the second sortie of Henebry's squadron lifted off. Fuel tanks were topped, ammunition belts reloaded, and minor mechanical repairs made in the field. Ground crews moved with quiet urgency, aware that the next attack could determine the operational fate of the 5th Air Force's experimental fleet. The aircraft roared into the sky in synchronized formation. The ocean below shimmered, reflecting the sun and the smoke from previous strikes. The Japanese ships that remained attempted evasive maneuvers, zigzagging across the water in a desperate bid to avoid destruction. Anti-aircraft guns spat fire skyward, producing a chaotic lattice of flak and tracer rounds. Henebry led the formation at 25 feet above the waves, maintaining the delicate balance between speed and control. Every pilot knew that even a minor error, too high, too slow, too early on the bomb release, could mean the loss of their aircraft and the lives of their crew. The first target was a transport trying to retreat northward. Its deck was relatively intact, and its guns were still operational. Henebry's forward guns roared to life. The fuselage of the B-25 trembled under the recoil, but the concentrated fire quickly disabled the transport's defensive positions. Simultaneously, skip bombs were released at point-blank range, skipping across the water and slamming into the hull. The explosion was immediate, tearing the vessel in half. Flames erupted, sending plumes of black smoke high into the sky. Nearby, a destroyer attempted to intervene, accelerating toward the attacking squadron. But the B-25's staggered approach and overlapping gunfire created a corridor of suppression, leaving the destroyer unable to effectively retaliate. Several pilots reported seeing rounds tear through its superstructure, damaging critical systems. The ship attempted evasive maneuvers, but coordinated attacks by multiple B-25s forced it to retreat. The final sequence of the attack unfolded with terrifying precision. Henebry's squadron split into smaller elements, targeting the remaining transports individually. Each run was calculated to maximize destruction while minimizing exposure to anti-aircraft fire. The forward-firing guns created lethal streams of fire that shredded decks and disabled machinery. Skip bombs impacted the hulls with devastating accuracy, igniting fires and detonating stored ammunition. Within the hour, all remaining Japanese transports were either sunk or rendered inoperable. Throughout the assault, the pilots maintained their composure under fire. Their training, combined with the revolutionary design of the gunship, allowed them to operate at the limits of both human and mechanical endurance. Aircraft were nicked by flak, engines overheated from low-altitude turbulence, and control surfaces were stressed to near failure, yet every B-25 returned to base. Crews reported near miraculous survivals, with some expressing disbelief at the aircraft's resilience. The psychological impact on both sides was profound. Japanese commanders on the surviving destroyers were stunned by the audacity and effectiveness of the low-altitude strikes. Their doctrine, built around the assumption that medium bombers could only threaten from high altitude, had been shattered. Meanwhile, Allied commanders celebrated the result. A single experimental squadron had neutralized a convoy that, according to intelligence estimates, would have taken weeks of conventional attacks to dismantle. By 1:45 p.m., the Bismarck Sea was a scene of near-total Allied dominance. Wreckage floated across the water, survivors clung to debris, and smoke marked the paths of destruction. The impossible B-25 gunship had not only survived the engagement, it had redefined the very concept of aerial anti-shipping warfare in the Pacific. Henebry's achievement demonstrated several crucial lessons: that innovation in aircraft design could overcome entrenched skepticism, that precise coordination could amplify small units into decisive forces, and that courage under fire remained an indispensable component of modern warfare. As the smoke cleared and the last survivors were rescued from the water, the scale of the victory became clear. 12 Japanese ships sunk in 72 hours. Thousands of troops lost. A critical reinforcement mission obliterated before it could reach La. And a new model for aerial combat, combining low-altitude aggression, skip bombing, and forward-firing firepower, established itself as a standard tactic in subsequent Pacific operations. The B-25 gunships returned to base one last time. They were battered, scorched, and pockmarked with evidence of their ordeal. But they had proved the impossible was achievable. And from the charred remains of the Japanese convoy, the Allies knew that the strategic balance in the New Guinea campaign had shifted irreversibly. The next chapter would examine the full consequences of this engagement, for men, machines, and the Pacific theater itself. The Bismarck Sea was silent, except for the crackle of distant fires and the soft lapping of waves against floating wreckage. The once formidable Japanese convoy had been reduced to a scattering of burning hulls and drifting debris. 12 transports and dozens of smaller vessels had been sunk, hundreds of soldiers were dead, and thousands more were stranded in the water, awaiting rescue, or never to be rescued at all. The magnitude of the destruction sent shockwaves through Imperial Japanese Command. Orders had been precise: reinforce La and secure New Guinea. Those orders had failed spectacularly. The troops and supplies that might have altered the balance on the ground were gone, leaving the defenders in a precarious position. Intelligence officers catalogued the losses: more than 3,000 soldiers lost, countless tons of supplies destroyed, and a psychological blow to a navy unaccustomed to losing entire convoys so decisively. On the Allied side, the victory was celebrated quietly at first, tempered by the grim realities of war. Crews returned to their airfields in New Guinea, their aircraft scorched and pockmarked from flak and sea spray, yet still intact. Engineers inspected the B-25 gunships and marveled at their resilience. The modifications they had argued over for weeks had performed beyond expectation. Ammunition logs showed that every round had been used efficiently, every bomb placed with surgical accuracy. Tactical debriefings revealed that the timing, coordination, and courage of the aircrews had been as decisive as the aircraft themselves. For the men in the B-25s, the experience left a mixture of exhilaration and exhaustion. Many described the scene over the Bismarck Sea as surreal: fires lighting the water, oil slicks burning under the sun, ships exploding as if ignited by some unseen hand. Pilots who had trained for months on simulated targets now faced the real chaos of war at low altitude, and survived. Gunners recounted how streams of tracer fire arched past them, and how they had watched anti-aircraft crews fall, immobilized by the intensity of the assault. Strategically, the implications were immediate and profound. The destruction of the convoy effectively cut off Japanese reinforcements to La, weakening their positions on New Guinea and accelerating Allied advances. Military planners studied the B-25 tactics closely, recognizing the potential for low-altitude, heavily armed bombers to dominate enemy shipping lanes. The success prompted rapid adoption of skip bombing techniques and reinforced forward-firing gun configurations on other medium bombers. Reports from surviving Japanese personnel painted a picture of utter disarray. Commanders admitted that their doctrine had been unprepared for coordinated low-level attacks. The psychological impact on crews, witnessing transports destroyed in minutes, gunners silenced by precise strafing runs, and convoys breaking apart under constant pressure, was severe. Some historians would later note that the battle marked a turning point in Japanese naval morale in the South Pacific, signaling that Allied air power could now strike decisively anywhere, even in areas previously considered safe from mass air attack. Equally important were the lessons learned for Allied leadership. Brigadier General Kenneth Walker and Major General George Kenney, overseeing 5th Air Force operations, praised the ingenuity and execution of the modified B-25s. Debriefings emphasized not only the success of the aircraft but also the meticulous planning, timing, and coordination required to exploit the enemy's weaknesses. They recognized that innovation under pressure, combining human skill, mechanical ingenuity, and tactical daring, could yield results that conventional doctrine alone might never achieve. On the ground, intelligence officers compiled reports and photographs from reconnaissance flights. Aerial images captured the smoldering remains of the convoy, the burned-out hulls floating like dark monoliths across the Bismarck Sea. Analysts catalogued every strike, every impact, and every movement of the ships before their destruction. The evidence confirmed what pilots had already reported: 12 ships destroyed in 72 hours, with minimal losses to Allied aircrews, a remarkable achievement in both precision and efficiency. Beyond the immediate military impact, the engagement set a precedent in the history of air warfare. The idea that medium bombers could carry out sustained low-altitude assaults, coordinated across multiple squadrons, challenged existing perceptions of what was tactically possible. The impossible B-25 had proven that innovation, courage, and precise execution could overcome superior numbers and formidable defenses. The victory at the Bismarck Sea would resonate for years. It was studied in military academies, cited in tactical manuals, and remembered by the men who had flown into the inferno. For the Allied forces, it was not just a triumph of technology or firepower, but a testament to the human capacity to adapt, innovate, and prevail under conditions that had once seemed insurmountable. Yet, even amid triumph, the human cost was undeniable. Thousands of Japanese soldiers had perished. Many Allied crews carried the mental weight of what they had witnessed: bodies in the water, explosions consuming entire ships, and the relentless demands of executing perfection in the face of lethal danger. The Bismarck Sea had been a battlefield where bravery and innovation converged, but at a price that would echo in memory long after the war ended. In the days following the battle, the scale of the Bismarck Sea victory became increasingly clear. Allied intelligence meticulously analyzed the wreckage, survivor accounts, and aerial photographs. Reports confirmed that the operation had achieved more than just tactical success, it had reshaped the operational landscape in the South Pacific. Japanese Naval Command, stunned by the rapid destruction of an entire convoy, struggled to replace the lost troops and supplies, leaving strategic positions along New Guinea critically vulnerable. The Allies immediately adapted their tactics across the theater. Low-altitude attacks with modified B-25s became standard practice, particularly against convoys in the Solomon and Bismarck Seas. Commanders recognized that coordinated strafing combined with skip bombing could overcome even heavily armed ships when executed with precision. The success of Henebry's squadron served as a case study for aircrew training programs, emphasizing the importance of teamwork, timing, and the calculated risk of flying in close proximity to enemy fire. For the men who had flown the mission, the aftermath was both exhilarating and sobering. Celebrations were muted, tempered by the reality of war. Pilots reviewed the photographs of burning transports and accounts of Japanese casualties, understanding that the precision and daring that had saved countless Allied lives had simultaneously cost thousands of enemy lives. Gunners who had fired continuously for minutes recalled the intense concentration required to maintain accuracy while under fire. Mechanics and engineers, too, understood the implications. The aircraft modifications they had labored over in workshops and field bases had proven decisive in a real-world engagement. Across Allied command, the battle was hailed as a turning point. General George Kenney lauded the operation as a demonstration of innovative air power, noting that the impossible B-25 gunship had redefined the principles of aerial attack against maritime targets. Tactical manuals were updated to incorporate lessons learned. Forward-firing armaments, skip bombing, and low-level formations became key components of doctrine, and the B-25's modifications were implemented across additional squadrons. Strategists recognized that air superiority, when combined with ingenuity, could decisively disrupt enemy operations, even in heavily defended waters. The Japanese response was desperate. Surviving destroyers struggled to regroup, but morale had been shattered. Many crews reported that the speed and precision of the attacks were beyond expectation, leaving little room for traditional evasive maneuvers. Orders to mount counterattacks were delayed or miscommunicated, compounding the chaos. Historian accounts later described the engagement as a psychological as well as a physical defeat, demonstrating that Allied air power had evolved beyond the predictable models the Japanese had relied upon for years. On the ground in New Guinea, Allied forces quickly capitalized on the weakened Japanese positions. Troop movements and supply lines became easier to secure, and local operations benefited from reduced enemy resistance. The loss of 12 transports and thousands of soldiers critically weakened Japanese defensive capacity, enabling the Allies to maintain momentum in the campaign. The strategic consequences of Henebry's squadron extended beyond the immediate battlefield, contributing to a broader shift in the Pacific theater that would influence subsequent operations in 1943 and 1944. The psychological effect on Allied crews was equally profound. Men who had trained for months in mock attacks now carried the confidence of real achievement. They had faced overwhelming odds and survived, their training validated under fire. Yet, they also carried the haunting memory of destruction, the fire, the sinking vessels, and the lives lost. Many would later describe the mission as the most intense combat experience of their careers, a moment when the limits of human courage and technological ingenuity were tested simultaneously. From an engineering perspective, the mission's success silenced critics who had doubted the modifications to the B-25. Reinforced nose sections, forward-firing gun arrays, and skip-bombing adaptations proved their effectiveness in real combat. Engineers documented every detail, noting how structural reinforcements withstood flak, how weapon calibration held under stress, and how crew coordination maximized destructive impact. The lessons learned influenced aircraft design and tactical doctrine for years to come. In the broader scope of the war, the Bismarck Sea engagement demonstrated the evolution of combined arms strategy. A single squadron, using ingenuity, discipline, and precision, had destroyed a convoy of significant strategic value. It validated the principle that technological innovation, when integrated with rigorous training and audacious execution, could overcome numerical superiority. The battle also underscored the importance of intelligence, reconnaissance, and timing. Every element had aligned to create an operational success of unparalleled scale for the Allies. By the end of March 1943, historians, commanders, and air crews alike acknowledged that the battle had set a new standard for Pacific warfare. It was not merely a victory in ships sunk or troops lost, it was a lesson in the transformative power of innovation, courage, and coordination. The Bismarck Sea had become a proving ground, one where the limits of conventional thinking had been shattered, and the potential of human and mechanical ingenuity had been realized. The stage was now set for the final reflection, what this operation meant not only for the war but for the future of aerial combat, technological adaptation, and the human capacity to redefine what is possible. The Bismarck Sea battle was more than a confrontation of ships and aircraft. It was a testament to the ingenuity of human courage meeting the rigor of technological innovation. A single squadron of B-25 gunships had transformed the impossible into reality, proving that bold ideas, when combined with disciplined execution, could redefine the limits of warfare. Henebry's aircraft were once dismissed as experimental curiosities, too fragile or too ambitious for real combat. Yet they survived flak, sea spray, and the chaos of a shattered convoy. They became symbols of adaptability, machines reshaped to meet unforeseen challenges, reflecting the capacity of human engineering to bend circumstance in its favor. The psychological dimension of the engagement was equally profound. For Japanese forces, the destruction of 12 transports in 72 hours undermined confidence, shattered doctrine, and exposed vulnerabilities that would reverberate through subsequent campaigns. For Allied air crews, it instilled a confidence born not of numbers but of precision, planning, and unyielding resolve. The victory was measured in ships sunk, troops neutralized, and supply lines severed, but it was also measured in courage tested under fire and innovation proven in practice. The legacy of the Bismarck Sea engagement extended far beyond the immediate theater of operations. Lessons learned influenced tactical manuals, aircraft modifications, and training programs across the Pacific. Skip bombing, forward-firing armaments, and coordinated low-level assaults became essential components of Allied air doctrine. The engagement demonstrated that ingenuity, discipline, and audacity could achieve what conventional thinking deemed impossible. In the end, the battle was a reminder that warfare is never solely a contest of machines or numbers, it is a convergence of human skill, daring, and vision. From the smoking remains of the convoy to the battered but victorious B-25s, the Bismarck Sea proved that the combination of courage and innovation could reshape history. It was an enduring lesson, even against overwhelming odds, the boundaries of possibility are defined not by circumstance, but by the people who dare to confront it.